and at whatever time in history, human beings have all had at least one thing in common. They have had to coexist with other human beings. From the simplest bands to the most complex states, our history has been the process of people learning to work together and to cooperate. Among human beings, society is universal, and for society to function, there must be order. Still, we are all individuals, each with a separate identity, a separate will, and separate needs. And these differences often lead to conflict. And conflict, unchecked, can destroy the order which holds society together. And so, all societies rely upon some form of social control to resolve conflicts when they arise. Or better yet, to avoid conflict altogether. These social controls include all of the rules, codes, habits, and customs by which a society seeks to ensure appropriate behavior. Socialization, the process of internalizing social controls, begins in infancy, when a child learns its society's ideas about what is right and wrong, and adopts the society's norms and values. Often, religion plays an important role in this process. The fear of the supernatural, or such concepts as sin and grace, help to shape the individual's conscience and behavior. And in some societies, such shared religious beliefs are sufficient to maintain order, cooperation, and continuity within the community. In eastern Pennsylvania live the Amish, whose ancestors settled here nearly 200 years ago after fleeing religious persecution in Switzerland. Since then, the Amish have preserved both their faith and their way of life, and they have done so through strict adherence to tradition and strong internal social controls. Today, there are about 75,000 Amish living in the United States and Canada. And although the technological revolution rapidly changes the world about them, they still maintain a way of life that predates the Industrial Revolution. For the Amish, it is one's place in their religious community which defines and gives meaning to their lives. And that sense of belonging, to a tradition as well as to a community, is cultivated and reinforced from the Amish cradle to the Amish grave. An all-important factor in maintaining the Amish community is their segregation from the rest of society. Peer group pressure, therefore, becomes particularly important in maintaining social control. The fellowship of like-minded young people both reinforces and supports their identity as Amish and enhances their ability to live within the community's strict social norms. When an Amish house or barn burns, all the members of the community will automatically pitch in to build a new one. The Amish farmer doesn't need a commercial insurance policy to bail him out. His community is the only insurance he will ever need. Failure to participate in a community effort like barn raising is inconceivable in such a supportive environment. For over 2 centuries, the Amish community has held together, and it has done so with little need for police or courts or other forms of external controls. Here, internal controls based on dedication to God and to the community have been sufficient to maintain order. In small-scale societies, internal controls alone can be highly effective. But as societies become larger and more complex, there is greater need for more formal social controls. Indeed, without extensive social controls to coordinate their many groups, systems, and individuals, larger societies would be reduced to chaos and anarchy. So, to create a balance between the freedom of the individual and the common good, larger societies rely upon some form of external social control, such as rules or codes of conduct to define proper behavior. In most societies, these rules have been highly formalized and codified into a body of law. And with agents such as police to enforce it, law serves as an important form of social control.
Remain seated and come to order. Quarters again in session.
Under Western law, a person who commits an offense is subject to a series of highly formal and complex legal proceedings intended to protect both the society and the rights of the individual. And there is a clear distinction between offenses against the state, which are known as crimes, and offenses against another individual, which are known as torts.
First of all, there's no question that in this matter, the unfortunate Miss Valdez was the victim of an unpleasant circumstance. The question that you have to decide today is whether or not the prosecution, who bears the burden of proof, has been able to prove to you that my client, Mr. John Daniels, was the one that committed this act upon Miss Valdez.
Western law derives from a long tradition of written law dating back to Moses and before. And it is so complex that it requires trained specialists such as lawyers and judges to understand and administer it.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it now becomes my duty as judge to instruct you in the law that applies to this case. And it is your duty as jurors to follow the law, as I shall now state it to you. On the other hand, it is your exclusive province to determine the facts in the case and to consider and weigh the evidence for that purpose. It's your duty as jurors to consult with one another and to deliberate with a view to reaching an agreement. And in case of a reasonable doubt whether his guilt is satisfactorily shown, he is entitled to an acquittal.
In less complex band-level societies, law tends to be far less formal. It's often not codified or written down at all. In these societies, all offenses are viewed as offenses against individuals, and the goal of law is not to punish an offender, but simply to restore social harmony. Among the Netsilik of Canada's Pelly Bay, a song duel is used to settle a dispute. The competition continues until a winner prevails, and at that point the dispute is considered settled and the affair closed. In other band-level societies, if a dispute cannot be settled, the unhappy party will simply leave the group. Among societies where there is some concept of property or territory, it is not always practical for an individual to leave. Some type of formal dispute settlement becomes necessary, and disputes are usually settled through argument and compromise. Among the tribal Nuer of Kenya and Ethiopia, the parties to a dispute will simply sit down and talk until they reach an agreement. The Nuer are a pastoral people whose cattle are their most prized possession. Not surprisingly, then, Nuer disputes are frequently over cattle. This man wants to divorce his youngest wife. When he married, He paid a bride price of 25 cows to her family. Now he claims the girl is infertile, and he wants his cows returned. The wife's relatives counter that some of the cattle originally promised have not been delivered, and besides, it is too soon to prove that the girl is infertile. This is negotiation, the direct use of argument and compromise to arrive at a settlement. But negotiation can be a slow process. A settlement might take years. Perhaps if this dispute drags on long enough, the young wife will become pregnant and thereby settle the dispute. More likely, negotiation will continue until a satisfactory settlement is reached. Among the Noondawalas of India, a somewhat more complex form of negotiation is practiced. It is called mediation and involves an unbiased third party who assists in the negotiation. Every 3 years, the Noondawalas bring their disputes before the traditional panchayat, a council made up of 5 elders. The panchayat will listen to the disputes and help the entire group to arrive at a settlement. This dispute concerns a man who was fined several years ago by a panchayat. He didn't pay. Instead, he left with his family and joined a splinter group. Then he died, and his son married within the group. Now the son wants to rejoin the Noondawalas because the splinter group is failing. The question is, to be reinstated, must the son pay only a small fine for marrying outside his caste, or a larger fine to make up for his father's past offense? To the Noondawalas, any offense is polluting, since it puts one out of their social caste. To pay the fine is to be reinstated. The man's kinsman would have him pay only for the improper marriage. The argument will escalate only so far. Then the panchayat members will call for conciliation. The group has made its decision. The man is charged with a heavy fine, and the guru gives his blessing to the decision. The solution is acceptable to both parties. Compromise is necessary, for unresolved conflict could again splinter the caste. The Noondawala's panchayat illustrates a process of mediation by consensus, which will continue to function as long as it supports the unity of the caste. And therefore, mediation for the Noondawalas is an effective form of social control. The Barabeg tribe of Tanzania practices still another form of mediation. It is called adjudication. Here, an unbiased third party actually makes a judgment and has the power to decide upon and enforce a final settlement. Barabeg women exercise a power unusual for traditional Africa. They have the power to convene a court and levy a cattle fine against men for the infringement of women's rights. 2 men have been found guilty by the women's court of watching a woman in childbirth, a violation of the sanctity of the human body. Each man has been fined 1 bull, which the women will beat to death with their sticks. One of the men hurriedly pays his fine. If the fine is not paid before the women reach his home, they will tear down his hut and return his wives to their parents. The two bulls have now been brought to the spot where they will be killed. The men make a final effort to reverse the course of events, but the women drive them away. Armed with sticks, the women carry out their sentence. In this Bella village in Liberia, another example of adjudication is about to take place, one which calls upon supernatural powers to make the judgment. A calf belonging to the village chief has been wounded. In order to find the culprit, the chief is called for a trial by ordeal. Bella's use of the supernatural in a trial by ordeal has similarities to the use of the lie detector in Western societies. Anthropologist James Gibbs explains.
In both cases, there's an element of judgment, of art. The polygraph operator can't just read the needles. He has to make interpretations as to when he's just getting a high level of anxiety as opposed to potential guilt. So I think you have in these two cultures, independently, the two cultures have hit upon the same scientific mechanism. In our case, it's clothed in the rhetoric of science. In their case, it's clothed in the rhetoric of religion. The ordeal operator says, I have a gift from God, but I think it's the same mechanism in both cases.
Among the Bella, trial by ordeal is an effective social control. The ordeal operator arrives in the village. He is certified by the central government as a licensed ordeal man. Tension in the village is high. The wounded calf has died. Everyone wonders what will happen. In this case, the ordeal operator will use the hot knife ordeal. He will rub a hot knife on the leg of a suspect. If the suspect is burned, he is guilty. If he is not burned, he is innocent. Anthropologists speculate about the ordeal mechanism.
I think that what the ordeal operator does is consciously or unconsciously to read those nonverbal cues, the gestures of the suspects, the tension in the legs as he is stroking the legs, the degree of perspiration, and make some kind of judgment as to who is showing so much tension that they are probably guilty, and then to use the knife to burn that person, either with the pressure of the blade, the angle of the blade, how long it stays in the fire. There are lots of things that are under his control once he has read the nonverbal cues that enable him to make that assessment.
Does the operator sense tension as he strokes the suspect's leg? And what do his eyes, hidden by dark glasses, search for? To prove that the ordeal is valid, the operator harmlessly strokes his own leg with the hot knife. Then he strokes the suspect's leg. He is burned, cries the village chief. He is burned. Soon a confession has been obtained. In disgrace, the culprit is paraded back and forth in front of the villagers, an example to all would-be lawbreakers. The villagers now return to their normal routine. The ordeal has worked. The supernatural principles have operated properly. The social controls of the Bella have once again proved effective. Whether it be by formal methods such as trial by ordeal or informal methods, some form of dispute settlement is needed to maintain peace and order within every society. Equally important is the need to maintain peace and order between societies. These Maasai elders have gathered to discuss an upcoming religious ceremony. Other Maasai groups will visit their village for the ceremony, and that worries the elders. Two of these groups have recently been fighting, and the elders are hoping to avoid violence. The different groups arrive for the ceremony. The new arrivals move slowly through the village. In the center of the village, warriors, women, and children greet one another. But as the warriors from the rival groups meet face to face for the first time since their clash, tension begins to rise. The refusal of a handshake. Fighting erupts. Although it appears that they are in earnest, the fighting is highly ritualized in form and is not intended to kill. Some anthropologists believe that warfare, even on a small scale like this, is more common among food-producing peoples like the Maasai. This conflict, in fact, began as a squabble over the alleged theft of some cattle, the Maasai's most prized possession. Indeed, there is reason to believe that war has become a serious problem only in the last 10,000 years or so. Since the development of food production techniques led to more centralized political control, possession of land and personal property, and food surpluses, therefore creating something worth stealing or fighting over. An elder holds up his hands, pleading for peace. Because he is respected, he has the authority to exert some social control. The fighting slows. Among hunters and gatherers, where there is no concept of ownership of land or resources, warfare is less common. In these societies, when there is scarcity of food or resources, some form of voluntary sharing or redistribution is more likely to take place. On a broader scale, this difference between hunters and gatherers and food producers may be seen as a difference in worldview. Hunters and gatherers tend to see themselves as part of nature and therefore in harmony with it. Food-producing and industrialized societies, however, frequently see nature as something to be mastered and exploited. Is it possible that such a worldview might also lead these societies to view other societies as something else to be mastered and exploited? Some believe that such an exploitative worldview is an important prerequisite to warfare between societies. Of course, there are other factors which often lead to war, like religion or ideology. Indeed, it is doubtful that any group of people have ever gone to war not believing that their gods and righteousness were firmly on their side. We've come a long way, from living in caves to walking on the moon, and from sticks and spears to nuclear missiles. In this century, attempts to provide some measure of social control between states and nations have assumed international and global proportions. And these efforts have met with some limited success.
It was immediately rejected by the British ambassador.
But the challenge to achieve order and prevent violence goes on at every level. Throughout history, individuals have learned to live in harmony within their respective societies, and societies have provided the internal social order in which people could live and work productively. The challenge now is to achieve some means of universal social control, to establish order and cooperation between the many varied peoples and societies that make up our world.